Thank you so much for joining me, guys. This podcast is going to be about the subject of money, economics, Bitcoin, cryptocurrency, and protecting yourself and positioning yourself in a way that safeguards your future. I just woke up a little while ago, so you'll have to forgive my morning voice. I'm just going to keep this as a real low-key, chill video. I wrote an article here. It's a bit unpolished, but I'm going to be reading parts of this to you as I record this. The economy is like a game of hot potato. No one wants to be holding the potato when the music stops, meaning no one in power wants the economy to crash on their watch. The powers that be want to push the crash off, no matter what it takes, into the future. The crash is inevitable. The longer it's pushed off, the larger the crash will be. The same system that is being used now was used back in 2008 when stimulus checks were issued. I remember receiving a check for $800 when I was a bit younger, and I got this check in the mail from the government. I didn't know what it was for at the time. I didn't really track with politics or the economy at all. And that's probably like most people today. I don't know why I deserve this, but I'm not going to say no to some free money. Quote unquote, free money is what I thought at the time, right? Sure, yeah, I'll deposit that in my bank account. I'm $800 richer. Why not? It'll help pay some bills. And I didn't think much else of it at the time. Luckily, I didn't stay blind to this phenomenon forever, and I did get introduced to Ron Paul, and later I got introduced to Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies, and I continued my own personal education into the subject of money and currency and how governments and the Fed treats it. And my eyes have been continually opened to the truth that we are unfortunately not told in our public educations. And I understand now that this is intentional because they couldn't get away with what they're getting away with if we were all educated in the subject of money and economics. So this is by design. And I'm very, very grateful that I, for whatever reason, had the insight to continue searching and seeking new knowledge that wasn't available in my traditional education system. Because the education system, I view it actually very similar to I view the media now, as my eyes have been continually opened and I guess I'd call it my awakenment process has occurred. But I view the media as a puppet of the powers that be. We'll just leave it at that. The powers that be, whoever those controlling influencers of society might be, whether it's the Federal Reserve or the central banks or the governments, or perhaps some entities above those dictating everything that happens below. But from what we've seen recently, whether it be in regards to the subject of health or the subject of finances or the economy, it seems that the media is the right-hand puppet for sharing knowledge to the populace. And the populace broadly gets its information from the media. So it's a very, very convenient setup to have the media and the education system reporting and teaching only what is in the best interests of those that control it. And so, anyways, while I was in school, I did learn many useful subjects. I learned basic math. I learned English. I read some good literature. I learned some basic science concepts. Did some PE, physical education, and all that's good. But it is interesting to me to note that one of the most important subjects that any member of a society could have, the bedrock of society, money and currency, and economics are completely omitted from education. And I really just have come to see this more recently, how completely omitted that is from all of our educations. And it makes sense to me now. I never questioned it before when I was in school. I never thought, hey, why is this thing not in my curriculum? Why is the subject of economy not in my curriculum? Why is the subject of knowing how to balance a checkbook, back in the day when we used a lot of checks, why is that not in my curriculum? Why is the subject of debt not in my curriculum? Why am I not taught those things? It's difficult to question that which is not in front of you. It's difficult to question an omission. It's much more evident to question something that's in front of you because you can see it. But when you can't see something, when you have the omission of something, the ability to know that you're not being told something is a very big challenge, because you have to have some kind of inkling that there's something omitted in the first place. And if you don't even have an inkling that maybe you're not being told something, that something's maybe being withheld from you, then you wouldn't have any reason to seek it out. And that is the clever, ingenious design of the modern education system, is that it's taking advantage of young minds who are in their formative stages and who are seeking knowledge to be able to better themselves for life and their future for the next 60, 80 years. And these people, and myself, and probably you as well, were not told the full truth, or I should say we're not told all of the important things that we truly need to know. Certain things, I feel, were intentionally withheld from us. And I see that pattern repeating itself in the media, and I see that same pattern in the education system. So that's just a long way of me explaining back to my story of I received $800 from the government in the mail in the form of a stimulus check. And I didn't ever question anything further beyond that point. Like, well, where did this money come from? And how is this even possible? I never even questioned these things once. And the reason I did not question it is because I was missing that education. I was, by design, by our society's design, missing an imperative piece of education that would have answered all those questions that I didn't even think to ask. Because nothing is free. Nothing is free. There is always a cost. So $800 coming to my bank account absolutely had a cost. I just didn't know what it was. And back then, I didn't even think to ask what it was. I didn't even question it. And sadly, I think that that is where a lot of society is today. They don't even question it, because we're seeing checks being issued today, just like back in 2008. And the cycle is repeating. I now see what is happening, and I now see what was happening. They were trying to keep the economy afloat and keep the game of hot potato from ending badly on their watch. And when I say they, again, I'm referring to the powers that be, whether it's the president, the Federal Reserve, or those entities in control of people. And so I now see that stimulus or quantitative easing or bailouts are simply a method, all different names for the same thing, of keeping the economy afloat long enough to push the eventual and inevitable crash onto someone else's watch. That's all that matters. Push it down the road in any way possible, even at the expense of hundreds of millions or billions of people. These people don't care, as long as it pushes it down the road and it doesn't end badly on their watch. And that's the really sad and really corrupt aspect of all of this. This is the same thing that is happening today, except that today it's on a much bigger scale. Today, instead of an $800 stimulus check, it's a $1,200 check, followed by additional rounds of checks. In fact, I remember reading from Trump recently that he talked about an additional series of rounds of checks that were meant to be issued, and then he blamed the Democrats for blocking it and blah, 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 politics, politics, politics. But at the root of it, he was encouraging additional checks to be issued. And the inflation of supply due to currency that was printed into thin air back then was nothing compared to the increases made to the currency supply today. It's all the same technique of kicking the can down the road, except that this time everything is bigger in scale. So with all of this being said, I see two possible outcomes for the economy, with an eventual crash being a certainty. One, the economy keeps getting inflated and money keeps getting doled out, and it works. Works is in quotes there. It works in that the economy grinds along, and even though the purchasing power of everyone's dollars are getting whittled away at a faster than ever before rate, the economy manages to stay afloat for another period of time before eventually finally crashing. And how long it will take to actually crash is anyone's guess. You know, they've managed to keep it afloat through 2008. So one thing we know for sure is that this system cannot, by design, go on like the way it is forever. That's a fact. So we know for sure that there is going to be a crash. It's just a matter of when, and the when is what no one knows. Will the system of inflation push us on for another 10 or 20 years? I don't personally think we'll last that long, but had you asked me 10 or 20 years ago, would I think that it would last this long? I'd probably also say no. And eventually we will reach the stages of hyperinflation. But whether that's in the next 5 years or 20 years or 50 years, I don't think that anyone really can tell you. You know, the interesting thing about looking at price graphs, and if you look at the chart of the stock market, for example, it looks like it's always the steepest where we are. So I pulled up the Dow Jones, and here's the S&P 500, just as two examples. And so it looks much shallower back 40 years ago. And even 20 years ago, you know, it looks fairly flat, a couple of bumps. And then only in the last 10 years does it look like it really took off, right? It's the trick of looking at a graph over a longer time span. And actually, it's the trick of looking at a linear graph as well. So really what we need to be looking at here is a logarithmic graph, because a logarithmic graph will paint this picture a lot more clearly. But the graph always looks steepest where we are because the increments are the largest, the inflation's the largest, everything's the largest. And so it's always the steepest where we are. But the point I'm making is that if we went back in time to 2001, right here, we would look at that chart, and that chart would look extremely, extremely steep. This portion right here would look extremely steep because there is none of this other data on the chart. And so right here, had you asked me in 2001, would I think that the stock market could continue to make new highs? Would I think that the inevitable crash could be pushed off longer? Or do I think that it would happen fairly soon? I would probably answer that I think that it would happen fairly soon. And here's a correction, you know, and here's a correction. After the dot-com bubble burst, we had this correction. After the housing market crash, we had this correction. But notice how every time it has quote unquote recovered. And it's a deception of the charts when you look at it because you think you're at the peak here. But really, are we at the peak? Or are we going to do just a bigger dip and correction and then go to a new high and then in 10 years have our actual crash? And that is the thing I think that no one truly knows. We all try to make our best educated guesses. And as time goes on, the odds of it occurring, that great crash, that great depression occurring, do increase. So the longer that we push it off, the greater the chances of the crash and the greater the size that that crash will be. So that all was the first outcome. The economy keeps getting inflated and money keeps getting doled out, and it quote unquote works for another period of time with the economy grinding along and with the purchasing power of dollars getting whittled away. That's outcome number one. Outcome number two is the game of hot potato finally comes to an end. There's a massive crash and correction for the artificial economy, much like we saw in the March of this year, 2020, except much, much worse. Much like 2008, except much, much worse. Because remember, the longer the delay in the correction and the more artificially propped up the economy becomes, the bigger the crash. So that's scenario number 2. The game of hot potato finally comes to an end. In both scenarios 1 and 2, the outcome is a massive crash and worldwide economic meltdown. The only difference is in the time frame. One scenario pulls off the scam for a little longer, and in one scenario, the scam grinds to a halt more quickly. This next section is called positioning. The answer to both of these scenarios is positioning. The question to ask oneself is, how am I positioned to weather the inevitable outcome of these two scenarios? If your money is simply tied up in dollars and derivatives of the dollar, then as time goes on, your money and savings you might have will reduce in purchasing power. Even though the number of dollars in your bank account remains the same, the amount you can buy with it continues to drop. And just to put this in perspective, I'm going to share my understanding of a friend I have and their financial situation. Of course, I'll leave them unnamed. So this person has been working hard. They're a middle class or upper middle class citizen, and they make good money. They make 6 figures a year, and they have amassed a savings of about $140,000 USD. And this particular individual has put that money in a savings account, just sitting in their bank, right? $140,000. Now, let's say that in some particular city right now today, just for the sake of where I live, we'll call it San Juan, Puerto Rico. We'll say that today in San Juan, Puerto Rico, this individual could buy the equivalent purchasing power value of half of a house. One half of a house with $140,000. And the thing that I think most people don't see is the deception that occurs here. While no one's going to necessarily take out that $140,000 and steal it from this individual, although that has historically occurred with bail-ins off the amount of money that people have in bank accounts. I believe back in 2013, any amount of money that someone had in a bank account over the amount of $100,000 was stolen and given to the government. So it's not out of the question. Do I see that being likely for the United States at this point in time? No, I do not. But it's not to say that that could never happen. So this $140,000 could be used to buy half a house at today's value in San Juan, Puerto Rico. And let's say that the scam goes on for another decade. Well, the thing that they don't see is that they're not going to be able to buy that one half of a house in San Juan, Puerto Rico anymore. They're only going to be able to buy a quarter of a house and then maybe an eighth of a house, even though let's say that they still have that $140,000 sitting in that savings account. And that's the hidden form of theft that this whole scam, this whole system puts in place. And that's what, unfortunately, some people don't see. They don't see that the gradual erosion of their purchasing power results in something as tangible as being able to buy one half of a house over time being reduced to being able to only buy a quarter or an eighth of a home. So their hard work and their labor was stolen from them by money being printed and given out to others. By having the majority of one's wealth in alternative safe haven assets such as Bitcoin, cryptocurrencies, gold, and silver, one can be economically positioned to be on the right side of the crash, the side that gains or maintains its purchasing power, while the purchasing power of the dollar erodes and eventually crashes in what will likely be more devastating than the Great Depression of the 1920s and the 1930s. When a government prints currency into existence, it's not creating new wealth. This is a key factor to understand. When a government prints currency into existence, it is not creating new wealth. Much as I thought maybe in 2008 by accepting that check, right? I accepted that as my new wealth. That is not the truth. By creating new currency and increasing the total currency supply, it is merely shifting purchasing power around from those who are not on the receiving end of the newly issued dollars to those who are on the receiving end of the newly issued dollars. It's a way to steal without actually taking anything. The dollars in your bank account remain the same. They just buy less. But the guy or the corporation that is on the receiving end of the currency generation, also known as stimulus or a bailout or quantitative easing, these are all different names for the same thing, gets more dollars than you get. So the guy that's on the receiving end of the currency generation gets more dollars than you get. Therefore, he gets some of your purchasing power. And that is the theft. If we all proportionately got awarded the same amount of inflation, then the theft would be mitigated. Then simply we would have inflation. Our total purchasing power for our total assets would remain the same. But when we have one sector of the economy receiving disproportionately a greater portion of that stimulus, bailout, or quantitative easing than another sector, that's where you get the theft. And that's where you get the movement of the purchasing power out of one area and into another. And this is best visualized as a pie, where the total pie area represents the purchasing power of the nation or the world. And your slice is the piece, the very, very thin piece of this much larger pie. And so when the number of units of currency gets printed, this doesn't increase the size of this pie. And that's the trick. The pie, representing total purchasing power, stays the same. Just the denominations of the units used to transact gets larger. Instead of a $1 bill buying a hamburger, it now requires a $5 bill to buy the same hamburger. In the future, it may require a $10 bill or a $20 bill to buy the same hamburger. As hyperinflation stages are reached, it will eventually cost $100 and then $1,000 to buy that same hamburger. When the amount of money in your bank account did not increase as much as the inflation, this means that you lost the purchasing power that your dollars once held. This purchasing power went somewhere else. It went to the recipients of the printed currency. The printing of currency is largely digital these days. It doesn't necessarily require actual pieces of new paper, but this can also be done. Now I want to make some comments on the subject of a fixed supply of a currency or an asset. Assets with a variable and loose maximum supply, such as the dollar, are susceptible to inflation. The total number of dollars in existence can be increased to any number desired or imaginable. This is why during the later stages of hyperinflation, it can take a backpack or a wheelbarrow full of paper currency notes to buy a loaf of bread. The currency supply was not fixed. Therefore, it took more and more units to buy the same thing. Assets such as Bitcoin, some cryptocurrencies, and gold and silver have a fixed maximum supply. Some are more fixed than others. Bitcoin is capped at a hard 21 million units, and is arguably the hardest money that has ever existed due to this fact. Cryptocurrencies can vary in how fixed or limited their total money supply is. Some are like Bitcoin, having a finite maximum supply. Some have a slightly increasing maximum supply with a fixed issuance schedule. Some have no maximum supply and can be printed much like the Fed does with dollars. It is important to understand this quality of maximum money supply along with other factors when selecting a cryptocurrency to hold one's wealth in. So just for a few examples of cryptocurrencies that do have a fixed maximum money supply are things such as Bitcoin, Bitcoin Cash, and Litecoin. Some examples of cryptocurrencies with a non-fixed and variable maximum money supply includes Ethereum, EOS, Tezos, etc. And this is not a comprehensive list of cryptocurrencies. It's just to give you an idea that the variety does exist out there. And there is every shade of gray in between. But there are some out there that literally have a absolute fixed maximum supply. And I think that that's a very important factor to look at. Gold actually does not have a fixed supply, as new gold is brought into circulation every year via the process of mining. And while Bitcoin shares this process, the amount of gold in the universe is not limited, while the amount of Bitcoin is finitely limited to 21 million units. Therefore, Bitcoin is ultimately more scarce than gold. Gold is still far, far superior to the dollar and still a very good choice for hedging against the losses of currency inflation and devaluation. But in my opinion, Bitcoin actually takes what gold does a step further and does an even better job than what gold does. But either of these assets would be far, far superior to holding dollars, or like my friend with $140,000 in their bank account, than doing that. And so this brings us to the final questions of this video. And the final questions I have for you are, how long will this game of economic hot potato last? Are you financially positioned such that you are protected from the dilution of the currency supply? Or are you susceptible to having the purchasing power of your wealth siphoned away through the process of currency issuance, also known as inflation, or quantitative easing, or bailouts? How much of your total asset worth is protected? And I think that last question is a very important one. How much of a percentage of your total portfolio, including all of your assets, is susceptible to dilution and decrease in purchasing power? And how much of your portfolio is resilient, or perhaps even will counter the effects of inflation? And I would make sure that, speaking for myself, that I have a majority of my wealth held in assets and things that do not devalue when the government or the Federal Reserve takes it upon themselves to simply print more money into existence. I do not want to be on the bad end of that stick. And that is the thing that my self-sought education in the field of economics and money, because again, you don't get that education from school. You are not taught this. It's really like tucked away and hidden. And it's there, in open sight if you go looking for it. There are many great speakers on the subject. You just have to go find them. And I guess I'll leave this video with this last recommendation, is that please watch the last video I did. I'll put a link in the description, called The Intentionally Missing Education of Money. And at the end of that video specifically, I make a recommendation of some various education sources that I highly recommend you spend a couple of hours educating yourself with. It will change your life forever, and it may allow you to look at the world in a different way, and it may allow you to make decisions that will help you, and it will help you into the future. And that's all I wish for you. That's all I wish for my viewers. The reason I record these videos and this content is because I want to help you make better decisions for your life. So guys, I hope that this has helped you, and I hope that you do appreciate this. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and let me know what you think of this podcast style format. I made it so that it will be good for driving, good for listening while you're doing something else. And I know that some of you like that kind of thing. I know that I like to do my laundry while I listen to podcasts, or drive while listening to podcasts. So I hope that this was able to help you in the same way. That's all I have for you guys today. I hope you're doing well, and I'll talk to you again soon.